welcome to another episode in our countdown to Halloween. Today we are discussing the buried moon, or the dead moon. It differs. And this is a spooky fairy tale collected in Joseph Jacobs' More English Fairy Tales. Now this one is more myth than fairy tale, and may have its origins in more of a moon worship passed down through the ages than an actual folkloric tale. It was first collected by a lady by the name of Marie Clothilde Balfour from the North Lincolnshire Cars in Ancombe Valley in around 1891. And she in turn stated that she heard it from a 9-year-old child who had heard it originally from her own grandmother. Now, you might not have heard of Marie Balfour, I certainly haven't, but you might have heard of her cousin. They had a very close relationship, and she in turn told him stories and he in turn told her his stories. And her cousin was a man by the name of Robert Louis Stevenson, who wrote Treasure Island and The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So, without further ado, let's dive right in. Now this tale begins with the long ago Carland, which is a boggy marshy area. And this Carland was all made of great pools of black water and squishy mools, which squirted when you stepped on them. Now the story goes that the moon herself was once dead and buried in these marshes, and now it is my turn to tell the story to you. Now the moon in the sky shone as brightly as you could imagine, and she lit up the bog pools so that one could feel safe walking through the bog at night as you could during the day. There was no dark little corners, there was nothing that could hide anywhere. The moon lit up the bog pool beautifully. But when the moon didn't shine was when out came the things out from the darkness. Boggles and all manner of crawling horrors came out in the dark to do evil and harm to whoever stepped in the bog. Now, because the moon was kind and good, when she heard of this, she was very troubled, and she decided that she would go down and see what kind of things came out to play in the dark, because she was sure it can't be as bad as everybody was saying that it was. So when the month end came, the moon stepped down, and she wore a long black cloak with a very big black hood to hide her shining hair. She went straight to the edge of a bog and looked around her, but could see nothing but dark water rippling and twisting snags all around. Before her, everything was dark, with only a small glimmer of light shining down from the stars twinkling above, and a small light from her feet which the cloak didn't quite cover. Now the moon drew her cloak ever more firmly around her, and trembled because she was determined not to go back until she had seen everything. And so she went, stepping lightly on tufts between the greedy water holes. But just as she came to a big black pool, her foot slipped, and she was close to tumbling in. She grabbed hold of a snag to steady herself, but as soon as she touched it, it twined roughly about her wrists and grasped her so hard that she couldn't move. She pulled, twisted and fought, but it didn't help. She was held fast. As she stood trembling in the darkness, wondering if any help would come, she heard something calling in the distance. Calling, calling, then dying away with a sob until the marshes echoed with the pitiful sound. Then the moon heard steps coming towards her, squishing in the mud, and saw a face white with fear. A man had gotten himself lost in the marsh and was struggling towards her flickering light that beckoned safety from the dark bogs. And when the moon saw that he was stumbling nearer and nearer to the deep hole, ever further from the path, she was so mad and sorry that she struggled and fought against the snag so much that her black hood fell back and exposed her shining hair. The beautiful light which shone from it chased away the darkness, and the man cried with joy to see the light again. All the evil things fled, and he could see the path out of the marsh. He was in such haste to get away from all the quicks, boggles and horrors that he scarcely looked at the light coming from the shining hair at his feet. The moon was so engaged with saving him that she forgot that she too needed saving herself, and that she was still held fast by the black snag. Now the man went, stumbling and sobbing with joy, his feet flying as fast as they could. And it came over the moon that she would very much like to go with him, which you would if you were stuck in a bog, and the only person that you'd seen, has just left. So she pulled and fought as if she were mad until she was exhausted and fell to her knees at the foot of the snag. As she lay there gasping for breath, her black hood fell forward with her motion and again covered her shining light, and with the darkness came the things which dwell there, with a screech and a howl. They all crowded around her, scratching, mocking, beating, shrieking with rage and spite, swearing and snarling, for they now knew her as their enemy, as her light forced them into corners where they couldn't carry out their wicked intent. "Drat thee," yelled the witch bodies. "Thou hast spoiled our spells this year agone, and us thou sentest to brood in the corners," howled the bogles. And all the things joined in with a great ho-ho, till the very tussocks shook and the water gurgled, and then they began again. "We'll poison her! Poison her!" shrieked the witches. And ho-ho, howled the things again. "We'll smother her! Smother her!" whispered the crawling horrors, and twined themselves around her knees. And ho-ho mocked the rest of them. And again they all shouted with spite and ill will, and the poor moon crouched down and wished she was dead and done with. They fought and squabbled until the sky turned to a pale grey, and they knew they had to conclude their work quickly. They caught hold of the moon with bony fingers and laid her deep in the dark water at the foot of the snag. The bogles fetched a strange big stone and rolled it on top of her to prevent her from rising. They also set 2 will-o'-the-wisp to take turns in watching her so that she could remain undisturbed and couldn't spoil their sport. And there lay the moon, dead and buried in the bog until someone could set her loose. But who would know where to look for her? Now the days continued to pass, and it came for the time of the coming of the new moon. Folk put pennies in their pockets and straws in their caps, so as to make ready for her, for the moon was a good friend to the marsh folk and lit the safe paths through the bogs for them. But as more and more days passed, the new moon never came, and the nights stayed dark, and more evil things terrorised the marshes. Now naturally, the marsh folk were terrified at this prospect, and a group of them decided to pay a visit to the local wise woman who lived in an abandoned mill, and they asked her if she could find out where the moon had gone. Now the wise woman looked in the brew pot, she looked in the mirrors, she looked in books, but she could not say where she had gone, and said to them that if they heard anything at all, that they were to come straight back to her, and she would give them direction. Sounds like a bit of a charlatan to me. Now as the days turned to weeks, and the weeks turned to months, it was only natural that tongues started wagging. At home, at the inn, and in the garth. And one day, when everyone was gossiping, there was a man who lived at the far end of the bog, and he was sat in the corner of the inn, smoking, and listening to all this gossip, when all at once he slapped his knee and stood up, saying, "My faix!" It's spelt F-A-I-C-K-S, but you can imagine what it was supposed to have said. And he said that he'd clean forgot and that he knew where the moon probably was. And he proceeded to regale them with the tale of the time that he himself got lost in the bogs not that long ago, and that when he was near dead with fright, a bright light had shone out and had shown him the path out of the bog and to safety. So naturally they all trooped off to the wise woman and told her the story that the guy had just said. And the wise woman looked in the brew pot, she looked in the mirror, she looked in the books, and eventually started nodding her head. "The way is dark," she said to them, but they had to go just before the night gathered. They had to put a stone in their mouths, take a hazel twig in their hands, and not speak a word to each other or to anyone else until they were safe home again. Why? You don't get to know. But she's got to earn a living somehow. They were to walk on through the bog and right into the middle of the marsh, where they would find a coffin, a cross, and a candle. And after seeing these, they would not be too far from where the moon was, and it just might happen that they might find her. So when the next night came around, they all gathered and they went into the bog together. Each of them had a stone in their mouths and a hazel twig in their hands. And feeling mightily creeped out, they stumbled along paths into the midst of the bogs, because remember, there was no light, and they couldn't talk to each other for reassurance. They saw nothing, but they heard sighings and flutterings all around their ears, and cold wet fingers touching their ankles. But they kept their eyes peeled for the coffin, the candle, and the cross. And soon enough they came to the great dark pool where the black snag was, and where the moon lay buried below. All at once they stopped in their tracks, quaking in their boots, for in front of them was a great big stone, half in and half out of the water, looking like a strange stone coffin. At the head of this stone coffin was the great black snag, stretching out its arms in a gruesome cross, and on it a tiny light flickered, just like the light of a candle. They all knelt down in the mud and said Our Lord, first forward because of the cross shape, and then backwards to ward off the boggles. But they didn't speak aloud, because if they did, the evil things that were around them would hear them and get them. They each took hold of the big heavy stone and heaved and shoved it up, and afterwards they all agreed that for one split second they saw a strange and beautiful face looking up from them out of the depths of the water. But the bright light came so quickly that they stepped back, blinded with amazement. And when they could see again, there was the moon, high in the sky, bright, beautiful, and as kind as ever, shining fully down into the bogs and making the paths as clear as day, her light stealing into the corners as though she would have driven the darkness away entirely if she could. So what do you think of this ghostly tale, which is more myth than folklore? And what do you think, if there is one, would be the rational explanation for the events just talked about? Leave me your ideas in the comments below, and as always, be sure to like this video, don't forget to subscribe, and have a happy Halloween.